The Malaysian airliner Israel invades Gaza, a crisis at the border, and a Senate bill on birth control. I'm Denisha Richard, and this is The Square Circle. Welcome to The Square Circle. I'm your host, Denisha Richard. Joining us today are Gregory Clay of gdclay.com, political consultant Leif Larson, and communications consultant Don Owens. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Well, yesterday, a Malaysian jetliner crashed in Ukraine near the Russian border, killing all 298 people on board. There are multiple reports that the plane was shot down, but as of this broadcast, that has not been confirmed. If it was shot down, it is unclear who and why someone would commit such an act. Mr. Owens, if this was a deliberate act, how does it affect the conflict between Ukraine and Russia? Would you call it a game changer?
Well, it's definitely a game changer, and I think there's some top-line messages we can take away about what happened yesterday, and then some very specific things all Americans need to consider. Number one, if you look at the media coverage of the issue between Ukraine and Russia and the rebels, much of the coverage is characterized the conflict as a conflict or a skirmish or a military conflict. This is very clearly a war now, and yesterday's actions illustrate that very clearly. So we need to call it that going forward. Secondly, it's a war because whenever one side or both obtains the military ability and equipment to shoot down an airliner at 30,000 feet, you are conducting a war. And our foreign policy needs to reflect that going forward. So that's two messages to look at in the top line. Secondly, I want to say is that Americans need to remember we don't need to rush into this war. I think the solution for this is found in Europe, and it exists in three very specific countries: Germany, France, and England. France, if they're going to complain about this and put out public statements condemning Russia, they should also consider whether or not they're going to give back the money they just received from Russia for the ships they sold to Russia. Germany needs to consider whether or not it's going to continue buying natural gas from Russia and maybe buy it instead from the United States, Venezuela, or some other country. And England needs to remember that most of the Russian oligarchs that were expelled by Vladimir Putin, whether or not you believe that was right or wrong, most of those folks live in London, England, where a lot of their money is in the London financial district. The solution for this exists in Europe, and also remember, we're here because the Ukraine wanted to join the European Union. So before we talk American troops, before we talk American intervention, or before we talk American designation of equipment or support, we need to see how Germany, France, and England are going to lead on this issue in this war.
This is a war of one country on another. Mm-hmm. The Russian Federation is conducting a war under the guise of a rebel uprising against the Ukraine. I think this further, when the investigation is done on all this, I think it's going to show that the fingerprints of the Russian Federation are all over it, and President Putin is going to have less of a place to hide. There's evidence out now that one of the lead commanders is a well-known Russian soldier who is going by a false name, mm-hmm. but everybody knows him in his community for being who he is. His wife and children live in Moscow. Mm-hmm. He's known for having been in Chechnya and conducting such operations there too. And the training needed. We discussed this earlier. The training needed to operate one of these high altitude and surface to air missiles is months. Mm-hmm. Whether this was stolen from a Ukraine military base, this Buk anti-aircraft rocket system, that's Russian. Whether it was stolen when they invaded a Ukrainian military base, whether it was at Crimea or somewhere else, in the part of Ukraine that's controlled by the rebels now, or whether it was given to the rebels by the Russians themselves, some training was needed. And the only people that have the training right now are the Ukrainians, who weren't going to train the rebels to use it, and the Russians. And I think there's a lot of evidence that's piling up to show that the Russians have their fingerprints all over this, and this is going to be very, very hard for the Russians to back out of. The only downside is this may embolden Putin just to say, well, the heck with it. I'll just invade Ukraine all the way. What else? How else can I? What else? What things worse can be done to me? So it's a perilous moment. It's a horrible, horrible tragedy. And where we go from here is going to be interesting.
Yeah, this reminds me of back in the 60s during the Cold War era. And that could be what's happening here. Maybe we are in the beginning stages of Cold War #2. Back then, of course, it was President Kennedy of the United States versus Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet Union. And back then we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, et cetera, et cetera. And back then the question was, who's going to blink first? Now we seem to be in another situation of who's going to blink first. The question is, what is the United States going to do? I heard Peter King the other night on the show saying that the United States, President Obama, should bar all Russian aircraft from entering the United States, as a way of sanctioning Russia.
Including commercial?
Including commercial. Yes, the whole shebang. And from the money side, apparently Russia, especially Mr. Putin, has all these offshore accounts in other countries, and trying to keep everything secret. Suppose President Obama goes public and tells the world about this. Because you got to figure the United States knows, CIA knows this stuff, of all the spying going on. I mean, suppose President Obama calls a news conference and says, hey, if you don't, come up with some kind of reparations plan or something, demand that Vladimir Putin and Russia repay the victims' families or something like that. Someone's going to call you out on all this, all the corruption that you're involved in, and all of the offshore secret money deals that you're involved in. It'd be interesting to see what would happen. Call his bluff, and other countries could get involved too. And the United States probably can't do this alone. It needs help. I hear that Germany and Russia are tight because of the trade issue. Angela Merkel. We should be willing to go along with some type of heavy-duty sanction against Russia. And some of these other countries who do major business with Russia, in the energy business, et cetera, et cetera. In the United States, I think President Obama has to get some of the other European countries on board, whatever they do. Yes, the European countries should take the lead in this, but the United States has to have a major part in this also.
Well, and we'll have a major part, and it goes back to a point I made, Denisha, is that everyone knows Vladimir Putin is propped up by two major systems in Russia. Its military and intelligence apparatus, and the as John McCain has used, the words he's used, Russia is a gas station right now. And that's where many of the Russian intelligence and many of the Russian officers derive their money, including Putin. Right. This is his war now. We cannot, when I say we, I mean the United States, I don't believe we can subvert the Russian military, nor should we try. But we can impact their finances, and that begins in Germany, France, and England.
Well, it's about time that we move on now. Before we move on, I'd like to remind our audience that you can submit your questions to our guests through our website, www.publicsquare.net. We'll answer as many as we can live online towards the end of the show. Okay, moving on. This week, we've also seen Israel launch a ground invasion into Gaza amid continuing rocket fire from Hamas into Israeli towns across the border. Now, Israel has taken plenty of international heat for its actions, but it maintains that to defend its citizens from Hamas's terrorism. Now, Leif Larson, is Israel engaging in legitimate self-defense, or is it using the rocket fire as an excuse?
Well, if we were talking about rocket fire from the Gaza Strip that was 200. I'll even go, somebody lobbed 300 unguided, basically rocket-propelled grenades into no man's land in Israel. This may be overkill. Hamas fired well over 1,000 mortars and rockets into the heart of Israel, further than they've ever reached before. This is a legitimate military action, as long as in the land invasion, Israel shows restraint, which they have so far, and conducts what they're saying they went in there to conduct, which is the destruction of these tunnels where all these things are stored. It just came out, yesterday that the United Nations found a store of rockets in a United Nations run and financed school in the Gazas. Which is a complete violation, and they say they're going to be doing an investigation into it. But, this isn't something that just happened overnight. But you only have to look back 9-10 years is when the Israelis pulled out all of their military, pulled out the settlers off of roofs of synagogues in Gaza, took them all out, turned over Gaza for self-determination, self-governance, and there was no closing of the borders. They had free access to go back and forth between Egypt and Sinai and between Israel proper. And what did the Palestinians do? Now, and when I say Palestinians, I'm referring to, probably better said, Hamas. The Hamas took control and basically turned the entire landmass we know as Gaza into a military base. They started digging tunnels. They started spending money not on infrastructure, but they started spending money on buying rockets. And this is not wholly a problem. I mean, that the Israelis have brought upon themselves. This is a group of people who have taken control, are using their own citizens as cannon fodder for basically good photo ops, because it helps their cause when there's dead children on the street. So they fire these rockets from schools, from hospitals, because they know the retaliatory aspect of Israel is going to kill civilians, and that's what they want.
Now, one thing I'm curious about is the terminology, the vernacular, the lexicon. I noticed the media, when I say the media, I'm mostly talking about cable media, are reluctant to say that Israel invaded the Gaza Strip. I noticed the operative term is incursion. You notice that? All derivatives of the word invade or invaders or invasion apparently don't apply here. And so when you hear incursion, you're going, what? I mean, what's the difference in, say, incursion and invasion? Is an incursion a small invasion? But you can't say small invasion. You got to say incursion. I just found that very interesting. I mean, what's the conspiracy behind that? Can someone tell me?
Well, I would say as someone who writes press releases for a living, it's often a factor of two things. Number one, who gets there first with the term, and who repeats it enough and loudly. It's part of the reason why conservatives are so good at messaging. They usually get there first, and they usually say it loudly and multiple times. I have different opinions about that. But I'd like to offer some words as an incursion, building on what you just said. The conflict between Palestinians and Israelis are one of the most just saddening conflicts in the history of mankind, because we have a consistent back and forth which is generally the same. And we're at the point in the conversation where people are demanding that Israel stops the bombing. And Israel says, we'll stop the bombing if you stop sending the missiles. And then the Palestinian says, we'll stop sending the missiles if you stop occupying us. And then the Israelis say, we'll stop occupying you if you stop sending terrorists onto Israeli streets and bombing our buses. And it becomes a rotating conversation that goes nowhere. And we forget how we got here. This started a little more than a month ago when a teenager was murdered, which led It was an extrajudicial killing of an Israeli teenager, which led in turn to the extrajudicial killing of of multiple Palestinian teenagers. Right. And that's what I think has clearly been lost in this discussion, is that Israelis and Palestinians have lost sight of the other's humanity, and that exists on both sides. Right. Palestinians don't respect Jews, and Jews, to some extent, don't respect Palestinians. Right. But there also is another larger question here. There is a large Arab world which is flush with money, resources, and negotiating abilities. And whenever these conflicts pop up, you don't see support from the Saudis. You don't see input from, maybe not as much now, but from the Egyptians.
Or Jordan.
Yes, the Palestinians are left out there alone, which leads the rest of the world to question the true commitment of the entire Arab world to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Because there's a lot of, again, as I said, resources and oil wealth that I think could be inserted into this discussion to mediate. And what you don't hear during these conflicts are any peeps from the Saudi Arabian government, any peeps from Jordan. Where are they in the middle of this conflict? And sometimes their silence is very telling.
As to how we can get to an agreement here, I think, number one, Hamas has to be gone. Fatah has some leadership that was going in the right direction, but Hamas overpowered them because they're the military wing and had money from the Iranians and basically have driven them out of any political partnership whatsoever.
When you say gone, do you mean dissolve or?
I think dissolve. They have to be driven out. The Palestinians have to take an attitude of no more. We have good leadership besides the military aspect of Hamas. Push them out. Now, if there's aspects of Hamas that want to set up some type of negotiations and a political partnership with Fatah, yes, let them join in. Hamas is nothing but a military organization who day in and day out plans how they can continue a war,
beating up on Israel.
And also on their own people. I mean, it's unthinkable how somebody could put a rocket launcher, knowing it's going to be retaliated against, in a school with children or a hospital.
Then the Palestinian civilians are the ones who have to pay for it.
Yes,
because they're the ones who end up dead.
Yes, But again, most of these people have lived their entire life under this conflict. So when you have somebody who grew up knowing that the people on the other side of this invisible fence, or actual fence in a lot of cases, are the enemy who have nothing but disgust and hate for you, it's easy to say, well, then I'll gladly put myself in line to be shot by allowing you to launch your rockets from my house. So it's very tough. I mean, we all look at it and say, if everybody would just put the arms down and negotiate, but there is so much hatred and violence on both sides. I don't know where you start.
And like Don says, it's a merry-go-round.
Yes.
Never-ending merry-go-round. It's like a loop. Go round and around and around.
But I think that's why it's called an incursion. It's not an invasion, because everybody says you can't invade somebody where you're already, occupying them. This is a police incursion or military incursion into an occupied land, which it isn't. I mean, argument for the West Bank, sure, I'll grant you that. But Gaza, no.
Well, before we move on to the next topic, can any of you tell me, do you think that there will ever be peace between Israel and Gaza? Do you think that it will ever happen?
I think like I said, it'll take the Palestinian people to say enough is enough. I think a good example was the IRA and the mothers in Northern Ireland and Ireland General said enough is enough. We're sick and tired of our children dying, and they would go out and grab their kids by the ears and drag them back at home instead of going to an IRA meeting. I think that's a great place to look, and there are on both sides. There's Palestinians don't love their children any less than we do. They're just in a tough spot, and I think that's where it might start. Is people just say enough is enough. I'm sick. I'm sick and tired of it. I don't care if the Israelis say they won. We're done. Israelis have to do the same thing too. I think they once made a pledge of land for peace. They gave the Sinai back to Egypt. They gave the Gaza Strip back to the Palestinians. It may take a little bit of that again. It'll be a very tough pill for them to swallow. But this, enough is enough.
But if you want peace, sometimes you have to give up something to get something.
Right.
I mean, that's what negotiations are. Negotiations are all about talking and compromise. And I don't know. I mean, I'm 57 years old. And the next obvious question for me is, will there be peace there in my lifetime? Or, I have
You never know.
Never know. Actually, I'm going to say, I would say no. That's what I'm going to say. I'm not going to say you never know. I'm going to just straight up say no.
Debbie Downer. Debbie Downer.
I have no choice in the matter. I have no choice in the matter.
I would say strongly, I do believe there will be peace in my lifetime, and I believe it in Gregory's lifetime.
Very optimistic approach.
If for no other reason,
approach.
America's made up of people from both of these countries, from both Israel and Palestine,
right.
And I believe that for the long-term belief in the goodness of humanity, I believe that both sides have to figure it out. But I also believe there's a further discussion that can be had about whether or not war and violence is the answer. As an African American, I'm also often looking at the Palestine-Israel conflict through the lens of the civil rights movement. And one thing that was figured out quickly by Dr. King and others is that if you're facing a foe that surmounts your abilities militarily tenfold, which is the case in Israel and Palestine, you have to choose a peaceful way of protesting, of showing the plight of your situation. And that, piggybacking on the end of what Lee said, is what we don't see in the Palestinian conflict, is their day-to-day suffering, because often what the news media will focus on are when they're sending rockets into Israel and the response that comes as a result of that.
Okay.
So,
well, each one of you gentlemen had great opinions on the topic. I can't wait to hear what you all have to say for the next.
It's a good segue into our next one. Palestinians and Jewish people make up a portion of our of our country themselves.
Well, another major story this week is the crisis at the U.S. Mexico border. An influx of unaccompanied children from Central America has overwhelmed the immigration system, forcing U.S. officials to house them in temporary shelters. Some Americans want to send them back to their poor and violence-ridden home countries, but others say that would be uncompassionate. Would you recommend as a short-term and long-term solution to this situation? What do you think? The first one, anyone can say it.
Jump on in.
What would you recommend?
I'll jump in
Short
with
term
that.
and long term.
I think there are some simple solutions short term. Short term, we need a Congress that functions, which probably means we need a Congress that's not under House majority of Republicans. The president earlier this week and the week before submitted a request for between $3.5 billion and $3.7 billion. And Republicans either did one of two things with that request. They either stalled it or ignored it. And I'd like to point out an interesting dichotomy. Leading up to the discussion, before these children started showing up at the border, Republicans attacked President Obama and said, he's being too lenient with these dreamers. We need to deport many of these folks. Then, when these children started showing up at the border, they attacked the president again, saying, he won't go to the border and take a picture with these children. This is his Katrina. I want to make a side note there to conservatives. There will never be another Katrina. They can stop looking for it, stop comparing it to Katrina. That was an unprecedented, catastrophic failure of both state and federal government. And what we're seeing at the border is not a crisis of illegal immigration. These are children fleeing a humanitarian crisis. Immigration from El Salvador and Honduras is also up in Costa Rica and Panama. Why? Because families are being brutalized there. So let's remember, these are children. If they were coming from Canada, I think they'd get a slightly different response. And that's what we need to do long term, is change our prism as Americans away from the Tea Party response and more to what our founding fathers and what the inscription says on the bottom of the Statue of Liberty.
Give us your, the
Statue of Liberty.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
But those people all came through Ellis Island. They all registered. They all, decided to become American citizens. They didn't sneak across New York Harbor or the Canadian border and come to the United States. I think this is, I wouldn't say a Katrina, and I would agree that it was a horrible failure on the state level, which was run by the Democrats at that time.
You didn't even say the federal level either.
No, the state has to bring the federal in on that. But that's another discussion.
Yes.
I think this is something that can be tracked back to the president's positions with DACA, with the well-known standing of where he was on immigration. Whether he himself caused this, it was his policies that did. and some surly and kind people in Central America picked up on it, and they said, "Aha, here's a loophole."
You're referring to the amnesty code.
And I'm referring to people that they often refer to as coyotes, and also referred to as gangs, MS-13, and the drug cartels. These people picked up on this and went around and told people, "It's a free pass." President Obama says, "You come into the country,
we'll take you.
You got it. You're an American citizen.
No
free education, free welfare. They're going to give you a place to live. They're going to give you health care. It's all on the golden other side of the Rio Grande. Come across. Now, did this happen overnight? Did Honduras all of a sudden just collapse into a murderous rampage? No, they haven't. It's been well documented, and the travel advisories from the State Department have been going on for close to 7 years now, telling Americans going to Honduras, this is a very bad and dangerous and violent country. Go at your own risk. Has it picked up? Probably has, and I think it has. I mean, it's now rated as the murder capital of the world. I mean, there's
higher than Iran.
Yeah, 82 people per 1,000 are murdered in this country.
Almost as bad as Chicago.
Right. Now, I'm going to ask you guys for some help here. In this, I was going to say Chicago is
it's paradise.
Going to send $4 billion down there, to help out the Chicago people. Where Honduras is in Central America here. What's the country next to it?
I think it's El Salvador.
El Salvador, and then what country comes after that?
Guatemala.
Guatemala.
Yeah.
And Guatemala's on the border of
Mexico.
These people are refugees traveling almost the entire length of Central America.
Skipping Mexico.
They're not skipping Mexico. They're
going through Mexico.
They're going through Mexico.
And this will tie into one of my stories for later on at the end of the broadcast. But the Mexican government has issued special visas to allow these people to move through Mexico to the border of the United States.
Yeah, however, didn't Thursday, correct me if I'm wrong, didn't Mexico say that it was going to try to shore up its borders, to Central American immigrants coming through?
Yeah, they did. They cut a special deal with Guatemala, which basically allows anybody coming across from Guatemala a 72-hour visa. We have people that come through down from San Diego to Tijuana for 72 hours.
Like a layover.
But 72 hours gives you just enough time to travel up Mexico to the border towns of the Mexico-United States border. Now, if these people were refugees and they were seeking to get away from the violence, Mexico can be violent, but it's nowhere near Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador levels. Why aren't they settling in a country that, number one, has the same language as them? They probably have relatives. It's very much similar to the homes that in the social networks they had to leave.
And the culture and the climate.
Right. Stay in they were being driven and they were being told, head for the golden
land of opportunity.
Exactly, land of opportunity. And as soon as you get across, there'd be no questions asked.
You're there.
Turn yourself into border control, and they will give you a green card and a path to citizenship and some money and everything else.
Everything you ever want.
Yeah, and this. So, is the president wholly responsible for this? No, but people who will find negative things in anything good, and they picked up on this. And I think the administration knows that this was something they had a hand in, and that's why they're trying to now, kind of cut this off and find a way out.
What are all the conspiracy theories going around that, that the Democrats want this? They help orchestrate this. Why? Election year. If the Democrats are.
It is interesting that they're being sent all over the country.
All over the country. Are you going to try to put them in? Special places, strategic places, with the election coming up, in the anticipation that these people will vote Democrat, because I think
these 6-year-old children.
Years from now, and they do have parents.
I've seen the dead vote in North Dakota. So,
6-year-old kids,
28
turning elections.
11, 12 years from now,
distraught.
You still gonna have elections,
and
don't forget the parents are around too. You get them there, and that's one of the conspiracy theories.
I think we can all agree that this is a horrible situation for these children.
Yes.
That we need to do something. I don't know if it's throw money at them. but I think there needs to be something to help these poor children and their families that have taken this dangerous, deadly, option in their lives. But we also need to find a way to convince people or to help them out in their own countries to not have to decide that this is what they have to do.
Right. Sorry, I have to jump on one.
Okay, quickly.
The Republican Congress has consistently, over the last 4 years, underfunded immigration courts in Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas.
All border states.
So they've contributed to the problem. And number two, the worst thing we can have, much like we always get from conservatives, are the photo op. Recently, we had Texas Governor Rick Perry and Sean Hannity go down to the border and pose beside a belt-fed machine guns with Terminator glasses, vests, and Dickies on. And everyone who saw the picture knows that if a shot was fired, they'd be the first two on the floor. These are children. And let's also remember and dispel this myth about immigration in America between 1880 and 1930. America didn't even require passports to enter the country until 1920. So when you talk about the major immigrants of that time, Germans, Jews, Slavs,
Irish,
Czech Republic, well, not in the Czech Republic, and the Irish, the only requirements you had to enter the country at the time, despite the Godfather image of how people entered America, you had to have official ID, and you had to know someone and have a place to stay. That's how many people entered the country.
Sponsorships?
So sounds very much like how people cross the border today. Let's not sensationalize this issue. These are children fleeing a humanitarian crisis.
So they need an official ID, but you don't require an official ID to vote to vote the country.
No, it's not in the Constitution. Founding Fathers.
To our next topic, in the wake of the Supreme Court's controversial Hobby Lobby decision, the Senate this week took up a bill that would have prevented companies from invoking religious freedom to avoid paying for contraception for their employees. It eventually failed. Mr. Gregory Clay, given that the bill passing the House was unlikely anyway, was this bill a cynical attempt by Democrats to gain support from women, or was it a real attempt to affect the court's decision?
Let's call it the Democrats trying to get the women back. That's the bottom line. Because they saw an opportunity and they tried to seize the moment. It was symbolic, of course, because as you said, it wasn't going to pass the House anyway. I mean, they didn't pass the Senate. I mean, it was voted down 56 to 43. You need 60 votes to pass something in the Senate. Is that right?
Yeah. You need a majority in a democracy, but the Senate is not a democracy.
And here we go, this guy. Anyway, so the Democrats can say, okay, look, the Supreme Court is against you. Republicans against you. Come back home. You can't go home again. That's what Harry Reid's trying to do. Harry and his crowd, trying to show women, hey, we are the safe haven. Come back to us. That's what that's all about. Okay. Because they're trying to get rid. Of course, this midterm elections coming up 2014, and of course, you want this to also carry over 2016. Because the Senate knows that Democratic Senate knows that it is in danger of losing that Democratic majority, right? The Republicans could take over the Senate too this year, and it's all a ploy, trying to show women that there's a safe haven. But from an economic standpoint, financial standpoint, one of the things that caught my attention in this whole Hobby Lobby thing is that, the idea of religious freedom and all that. It's easy to say, oh, I'm not doing that. That's against my religion. I heard that. During the civil rights movements, a lot of times people say, "Oh, well, we can't do that. It's against our religion." Now you can say, "This place can't be desegregated. It's against my religion." It has to be segregated. But from a financial standpoint, what tripped me out was that people who work at Hobby Lobby, I understand, have 401ks. Okay.
Yes.
You have a 401ks. What's 401ks about? Stocks, bonds, etc., etc. Now, my understanding is that as part of the Hobby Lobby 401ks, you have mutual funds, etc., that that contain companies that do what?
Benefit and
make contraceptives.
Yes.
Okay. So is that trying to have it both ways here? On one hand, you can make some bread, i.e., money, with your company. That's okay. If you have contraceptive making companies in your 401k. But no, it can't be part of your health plan or whatever.
Well, I mean, the thing to remember is, and I'll go from there and kind of address what you just said. Back, I think it was in the 70s and the 80s, they found a lot of unions had investments in South Africa, who at the same time were saying apartheid is evil and everything else, but they were making a lot of money for their retirement programs in South Africa until that came to light and they were forced to divest. And a lot of these 401k things, they constantly are moving. They're changing. They're moving money out of this and that.
Right, that was a jumbled mass because of the mutual funds.
The other thing to remember is, out of 20 forms of contraception, Hobby Lobby was asking for a ruling on
4 of them, right?
4 of them,
right?
Because they thought it wasn't a contraception as much as it was a termination of a pregnancy, an abortion,
right?
So that's where we're really at. I think what is telling, and you mentioned it earlier, that the Senate is not a democracy, and I think the Democrats believe that. They also believe, as was proven out by Nancy Pelosi, saying she no longer trusts the Supreme Court of the United States. This, I think, is a telling moment for the Democratic Party. What they do trust is one of their own in a position of power to make decisions on laws and to execute those. I'm referring to the president using executive orders to change laws, make laws, do what he thinks should be done because he says democracy has failed us. And now we have the minority leader of the House of Representatives saying, "I don't trust the third arm of our legislative and governing branches." I don't know how you can say that. That's basically saying, I think the Constitution's failed us and we need to look elsewhere. Now, she started backpedaling right away from this, but I think it's where most Democrats believe. The Senate's no longer functioning. The House hasn't functioned because the Republicans, kill everything. We need what? I don't know where you go from there, besides take control of them.
Don Owens knows.
We have to go back to a couple points. First of all, the Democratic Party hasn't lost the women or the women's vote. We haven't had to work very hard from it because whether it be legitimate rape or whether it be fighting against equal pay laws, it's clear where most conservatives and Republicans stand. We even had a female member of Congress this week, a Republican, Renee Elmers from the 2nd District of North Carolina, say publicly that the Speaker of the House, when giving presentations, that men should make presentations that talk down to women so that they can better understand. It's very clear.
That's not a good sign.
It's very clear where Republicans stand on the rights of women. With the Hobby Lobby case, the Supreme Court basically has weaponized the First Amendment. And this all goes back to the last Republican candidate for president, who said what most Republicans stand for. Corporations are people too, my friend. Of course they are.
I kind of, they have, it's a publicity thing, like the bill in the Senate was. It was nothing more than...
You're talking about the Democratic bill?
Yes, okay. Exactly, in the Senate. It wasn't going to pass. I think there was plenty of Democrats that weren't going to vote for this, and they may have only voted for it out of the fact that they knew it wasn't going to get out of the House.
Entirely possible.
I think we're slowly seeing a change from separation of church and state to where people want the state to tell religion what they can and cannot do. And I think that's a dangerous precedent. Now, you said they've weaponized the First Amendment. I think a lot of Democrats and a lot of progressives would like to weaponize the government to tell religions what they can and cannot do. I mean, I think a great position to take is where a lot of the stuff has gone on equality of marriage for gay marriage. Gay marriage proponents have taken government out of it completely, out of the religion. The argument there is, let's have equal marriage. But if you're of a church and you don't want to marry these people, that's fine. That's we're not asking you to marry them. We're just saying when they do get married, they should be treated equal under the law. Now, on the Hobby Lobby thing, I think there was an interpretation. Now, the Nationalization of Women on their Dirty 100 had the Sisters of Anne. This is a group of nuns who house the elderly homeless. And they didn't want to use their money on health care to purchase contraception. These are nuns. Now calls them dirty, who are housing the elderly, homeless. And this is because the war on women. It's a great campaign phrase. you might have said conservatives, put out the good word and say it loud enough. War for women, I think you're going to hear every Democrat around the country, war on women, it's a war on women. This person's a war on women. This woman who's running as a Republican is carrying out a war on women. It's a great catchphrase. It's worked in the past.
Great alliteration.
It's propaganda.
It would only be propaganda.
I would hope the president said no propaganda on the Malaysian flight. Let's get away from propaganda.
It would only be propaganda.
propaganda.
It would be only be propaganda if specific examples didn't exist. Clay Aiken, the former Senate candidate from Missouri, is back in the news this week.
Not Clay Aiken.
Not Clay Aiken. That's the singer.
That's the singer.
Idol.
He's running for Congress.
He is running for Congress.
Not Clay Aiken.
Sorry, had Aiken on the brain.
Yeah.
Came out this week and said again, I have staff members who have children as a result of legitimate rape. That's been said by Republicans in Arkansas. It's been said in North Carolina. It's been said in Missouri.
Did Aiken win after he said that comment?
He would have.
He would have?
Yes.
But
Wait, what do you mean he would have?
he lost.
He would have if he had won the primary. He would have been elected by the Tea Party in Missouri.
No, I don't think.
You don't believe he would have won?
I think. Well, he may have won. I don't know. I mean, it's all supposition. But stupid is as stupid does, and there's plenty of dumb people on both sides of a political philosophy.
No kidding.
I mean, a lot of them do get elected and end up in the hill up over here.
No kidding.
Well, I think if they're going to opt out of all contraceptions, they should opt out of providing Viagra for their male candidates, male employees
That's
as
a
well.
waste too.
Very interesting opinion.
But it's still covered. You cannot use religion to deny people fundamental rights enshrined in the Constitution, especially using religion, which in America gets taxpayer-funded subsidies to exist. They're using taxpayer dollars to discriminate against American taxpayers. It's wrong.
Earlier you said there was nowhere in the Constitution that says you have to have an ID to vote. Where in the Constitution does it say you have to have birth control?
Two different arguments. The birth control argument is based on a bill that was passed into law. It's law.
Well, that can always change by
that
the
no
president's
Republicans
executive
voted
director.
for.
But the whole argument of using religion as defense, I still say is dangerous. Because, if you broaden what the Supreme Court did, if you broaden it could be used for a multitude of things. You could say, say you run a small family-owned restaurant in Birmingham, Alabama, and you have this decree: we don't want any black customers in our restaurant. And then you could say, well, it's against our religion. We don't want any black customers in our restaurant. We're a small business, because wasn't the Supreme Court case involving Hobby Lobby? It was more geared toward small business, family-owned type.
Right.
Am I
but
right?
it was also geared towards Scalia and Kennedy said this is a very narrow decision. And in fact, they said it can't be applied to refusing homosexuals your services, because that's a civil rights matter. Mm-hmm. So this is very narrow. You won't hear that in the war on women. This is going to lead to they're going to want to put a camera in your vagina or something like that. This is very narrow. It's pinpointed on the contraceptive aspects and only a few contraception. They're not banning all contraception.
4.
Right.
There's no way this decision is narrow.
But
it's beyond the slippery slope.
I can see someone trying to broaden this. That's my whole argument.
Sure, and I appreciate
that's my whole argument.
Let them bring it to the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court wants to hear it, then they can do it. But of course, the Democrats don't trust the Supreme Court anymore. So I don't know.
Because the Supreme Court is really hurting President Obama. I mean, he's lost like 3 or 4 cases in a row, right? That have hurt his his master plan.
When you violate the Constitution as president, you're going to lose those cases.
You're going to lose.
I know, it's really hard to violate the Constitution when you've done a third less executive orders than the previous president.
We are now going to talk about the most underreported story of the week. I am going to begin with you, Mr. Leaf. I haven't heard from you in a while, so I guess we can start with you.
Mr. Leaf.
There we are. I think it kind of goes back to our immigration issue. I think the most underrated and uncovered story was the beginning of July into June agreement between Mexico and Guatemala, which I think indicates that this was a well-known thing that was coming. The Mexican government and the Guatemalan government agreed to open their borders, and Mexico agreed to allow people moving from Guatemala or through Guatemala, giving them a 72-hour special visa to travel in Mexico. I think the timing of this is really interesting, if of the fact that these two countries made this agreement, allowing this huge influx through Mexico of children who rode on top of trains and on buses, cramped in like sardines. So I think the fact that this hasn't been covered and hasn't really been looked into is a story that people should look into themselves. Why did Mexico and Guatemala decide at the timing that they did to give these special visas for people traveling from Guatemala or through Guatemala to make it to the U.S. border, which just happens to take about 72 hours?
The story that I think has been underreported this week has received a little bit of coverage, but it deserves much more. Tonight, you're going to see me do something I rarely do, but something I'm proud to do. Tonight, I'm standing up for a Republican-elected public official. His name is Adam O'Neill, and he's the mayor of tiny Belhaven, North Carolina, in eastern North Carolina. Mr. O'Neill, Mayor O'Neill, other than being a Republican, is also the prototype of what a politician should be. He's standing up for his hometown citizens. And as we speak right now, as we film tonight, he is in the 5th day of a 4-week walk from Belhaven, North Carolina to Washington, D.C. And he's walking, in fact, he probably should have just crossed the Virginia border 2 hours ago. He's walking because his local rural hospital was closed because Vidant Health wanted to close it because they didn't feel they were making enough money. And he's walking to Washington, D.C., 300 miles, 4.5 weeks, in order to draw attention and pressure the U.S. Justice Department to pursue their injunction that they filed a year ago, but has sort of died off, against Vidant Health to reopen the hospital. And it's interesting to know that Mr. Mayor O'Neill is a mayor in an area that is predominantly Democrat, but he gets support from both parties because he does things like this. Stands up for his constituents, stands up for what's right, and fights for rural health care. And there's also, interesting enough, a provision written into Obamacare called ACOs that the Justice Department can use to reopen this hospital. And I want to congratulate Mayor O'Neill and his constituents for sticking behind him. Continue that walk, and when you get here in 3 weeks, I'll be right there to greet you with everyone else. We've got to reopen that hospital.
This is the deal. By now, most people heard about the situation in Jersey City, New Jersey, in which a guy killed a police officer, apparently for no reason, just shot him. And the cops killed the guy. And the local community in Jersey City built a shrine. And the next question is, the shrine was built for whom? It was built for the cop killer, the guy who killed the police officer. And the mayor of Jersey City, of course, is irate, and for obvious reasons, et cetera, et cetera. And the guy who was covering the story for a TV station in Jersey City, Sean Bergen, who's covered a lot of crime stories and housing projects, et cetera, in Jersey City, reported the story, and then he kind of went off on his own a little bit. Like he said, I went off the reservation. And he admitted it. I give him credit for that. When he, I'm paraphrasing, when he basically said one of the reasons that some people in Jersey City kill police officers is because they grow up in these housing projects in fatherless homes. That's a major problem with black males in Jersey City, growing up in fatherless homes. And he caught a lot of flack for that. Why? Because he editorialized. He made this connection that a lot of people felt that really wasn't there. He provided no evidence that black guys who grew up in fatherless homes grew up to be cop killers. A lot of people interpreted that as he's saying, just like an absolute, an automatic correlation. You're a black guy, grew up in a father's home, housing project. Oh, you are destined to be a cop killer. And he took a lot of flack for that. Because of his editorializing, his station demoted him, basically gave him a job and cut his pay, which they said, okay, you'll be doing soft feature stories from now on, instead of, these hard news, hard crime stories. And he, in turn, said, oh, I can't do that, I resigned. So he resigned. And but the thing about it is that so often in our country, people want to kill the messenger, I guess sometimes people like me, the messenger, and without looking at or examining some of the things that Sean Bergen said. He did bring up an interesting point. Granted, it may not have been in the right situation, where he provided no evidence about black guys in fatherless homes becoming cop killers, but black guys growing up in fatherless homes is a major issue in this country. It's at the core of the destruction and dysfunction of many black families in this country. But and one thing I agree with him on, he also had a comment saying, and I paraphrase again, that because of the stark raving liberals, you can't talk about it publicly. I agree with him on that. And a lot of things that happen, people, you can't say that, you can't say that. So the liberals have to go out and essentially try to destroy you. And he was caught up in that. And I read something that Howard Kurtz of Fox News Channel said the other day. Instead of demoting the guy, which in turn led to him resigning, why didn't you say, reprimand him and then bring him back and have him do like a, 5-part series on the issues of black males growing up in fatherless homes? Mm-hmm. I agree with Howard Kurtz on that. That would have done more in regards to the issue, as opposed to say, okay, he's a messenger. He said something he shouldn't have said. Oh, got to get rid of him. And then never talk about it.
Right.
And I'm going to say this now, and I've said this numerous times. I've been saying this for the past, I go back 20 years, back when I was working in Newsday. Okay, one more time. Political correctness is destroying black folk in this country. Okay? I said it 20 years ago. I'm saying it in 2014. And I'm not changing now. And it's it's like a curse. People are so scared to say certain things and call somebody out and say, hey, what you're doing is not right, as opposed to just accepting everything as the norm. Because it happens so much now, people just throw up their hands, oh, well, that's the norm. And I got nothing to say. And Sean Bergen went out, went off the reservation and tried to bring attention to this. I get a guy credit for that. Would I have fired him? No. Or demoted him? No.
Yeah, he'll probably get a job with Fox.
Yeah, he probably will. Because I was thinking the same.
At least.
I was thinking the same thing. I don't think he's going to be unemployed for very long.
No.
Because I could see him going someplace, and if he didn't want to be a straight news correspondent again, get a gig as a commentator.
Yeah.
Get a gig as an editorial columnist.
Maybe the NAACP will hire him.
Very funny. Ha ha ha. I love your sense of humor, man. But anyway,
don't be politically correct, Greg. Just say what you mean.
But going back to the situation, some of these things have to be talked about, at some point, and instead of trying to cover up everything in the interest of political correctness and, as Sean Bergen said, stark raving liberals.
Well, as usual, I think you guys had great comments on every topic this evening. And that is all that we have for this week. I would like to thank our guests for visiting us, and thank you for watching The Square Circle. We'll see you next week.